He looks so ugly.
Stop playing with me.
And he looks like a monkey.
Stop playing with me.
And then it
Stop
sure looks
playing.
like a iron web. Oh, yucky.
In these photos, Rica looks like any other happy child, doesn't she? But what you can't see in these moments is the deep pain she endured behind closed doors. Pain so severe that it eventually cost her life. She was beaten, neglected, and silenced. Rica went through things no child should ever have to. And the worst part? It wasn't a secret. Her injuries were visible. Her cries for help were heard. But no one acted in time. In the months leading up to her tragic death, Rica's school had raised concerns about bruises and her unusual behavior. Investigators later uncovered shocking video footage showing Rica being harmed by her father's girlfriend, 𝐸𝐭. Alongside that, there were chilling text messages between two adults who were supposed to care for her. Messages discussing punishments as though Rica's life didn't matter at all. This is a story of unimaginable cruelty. A young girl trapped in a home where love was replaced by violence. It's also a story of a system that knew Rica was in danger but failed to intervene. She was a child screaming for help in a world that refused to listen. How does something like this happen? How does an innocent child, whose cries were heard by teachers, neighbors, and even child protection workers, slip through the cracks? This isn't just about harm. It's about a broken system that let it continue. But before we dive into her story, I want to take a moment to thank all of you, my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments helps make these stories matter. If you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Now, let's begin. Before her name appeared in the headlines, Rica Rountree was simply a little girl, full of life, just like so many others. She was born in 2008, and her mother, Antoinetta Simmons, worked hard to give her a sense of safety, even as their world seemed to fall apart. Rica's personality was infectious. She had a way of spreading joy wherever she went, like a light that never seemed to dim. Whether through her playful songs or heartfelt compliments, Rica made everyone around her feel special. One of Rica's greatest joys was her love for dolls, but for her, they weren't just toys. They were everything. Rica treated her dolls as if they were her own children. She dressed them carefully, fed them, tucked them into bed each night, creating a world where everything felt safe and magical. It wasn't just play for Rica. It was her escape, a world where she could protect others, a place where life's harsh realities couldn't touch her. But it wasn't just her imagination that defined Rica. She was kind, thoughtful, and full of warmth. These qualities made her the apple of her mother's eye. Antoinetta, her mom, recalls how Rica was always by her side, like a best friend. Wherever I went, she was right there with me, Antoinetta remembered. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my best friend. We'd laugh, play, and every day felt like a new adventure. But as we know, no family is immune to life's challenges. In 2016, Rica's world began to change in ways no child should ever have to face. Antoinetta, a single mother, was facing the crushing weight of financial struggles. The constant pressure to provide for her children led her to make a decision no parent ever should have to make. With the constant fear of losing everything, Antoinetta turned to selling illegal substances, not out of greed, but out of sheer desperation. It was a decision born of necessity, not malice. But in September 2016, her world came crashing down when she was arrested. For Rica and her older brother, this marked the beginning of an uncertain future. Rica was placed into the custody of her biological father, Rica Rountree, a man Antoinetta had always been wary of. The pain of that day was overwhelming for 𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻. She pleaded with the authorities, begging them not to send Rica to live with her father. She had an instinct that something was wrong, but her pleas went unheard. "I begged them not to send her there," 𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻 later recalled. "I knew she wouldn't be safe. I told them something wasn't right, but no one listened." She went on to say, "They didn't care. They saw my arrest, not the bond I had with my daughter. They didn't understand how well I knew her. They didn't listen to my concerns about her safety." 𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐻 didn't know that Rica wasn't just going to live with her father. She was entering a home with a dark history. Richard's girlfriend, Cynthia Baker, had a past filled with troubling allegations, including accusations of violence against children. Yet, despite her history, the system overlooked these red flags. In the eyes of DCFS, placing Rica with her father seemed like the safer option. They disregarded 𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐻's concerns and chose to ignore the potential danger. What they couldn't see, or perhaps chose not to see, was the trauma that was waiting for Rica. From the moment she stepped into that house, her life as she knew it was over. At just 8 years old, Rica found herself subjected to cruel and unforgiving treatment. She was forced to carry heavy cans for hours, her small arms shaking with the strain. Every time she faltered, Cynthia would lash out, making the punishment even more unbearable. This wasn't a momentary ordeal. It became a regular, grueling routine. Rica was isolated from the family. While other children ate, she was left to sit alone, hungry and humiliated. Her clothes were worn and tattered, signs of the neglect she was enduring. She didn't even have a bed of her own, just a bare mattress on the cold floor where she was left to sleep after each exhausting day. And her dolls, once her comfort, were destroyed, leaving Rica with nothing to escape into. The world she had once created in her imagination was slowly taken away from her. The emotional toll was even worse. Cynthia's goal wasn't just to hurt her physically, it was to break her spirit. Rica was kept away from everyone, isolated from the love and care that every child deserves. A young girl who should have been surrounded by joy and laughter was instead trapped in a cycle of fear. Despite several attempts by teachers, neighbors, and others who noticed the signs of harm, the system repeatedly failed Rica. In early 2016, a teacher at her school noticed bruises on Rica's arms and reported it to DCFS. Investigators visited the home, but no real action was taken. Weeks went by and the bruises remained. In September of the same year, another teacher observed marks on Rica's face. This time, the report was escalated to DCFS, but once again, the case was closed with no further investigation. There was no follow-up to ensure Rica's safety, and no one bothered to check on her well-being. In the fall of 2018, Rica, just 8 years old, began attending Fox Creek Elementary in Bloomington as a third grader. It was here that, once again, a disturbing event occurred that would trigger another investigation from DCFS. The school, where Cynthia's 6-year-old daughter was also enrolled in kindergarten, became the setting for an unsettling situation. One cold day, the school staff noticed something troubling. Rica had come to school without a winter coat, despite the freezing temperatures typical for Illinois. In an act of kindness, the staff offered Rica a warm coat, the kind that every child deserves. However, instead of expressing thanks, Cynthia stormed into the school, furious and accusing the staff of showing favoritism toward Rica over her own daughter, who already had a coat. This bizarre incident didn't end there. Just a few days later, on December 10, 2018, DCFS received another report of abuse involving Rica. School staff had noticed something even more concerning. Rica had missed 2 days of school, and upon returning, she had 2 black eyes, each at a different stage of healing. This was the moment that could have made a difference. DCFS sent Patricia Shannon, a child protection specialist, to investigate. Rica's injuries weren't new, but the system seemed to be moving through the motions once again. Shannon arrived at the school, prepared to question Rica about the marks on her face. The school nurse, Polly Bailado, expressed concern about the bruises, which didn't seem consistent with a simple fall. Despite this, Rica, understandably too scared to speak up, explained that she had been sick for a day and then had accidentally fallen onto her toys while packing them in her closet. The lie was a defense mechanism. Rica, like so many children in her position, was terrified that speaking the truth would lead to more punishment. Antionetta, Rica's mother, had a sinking feeling. She feared Rica was hiding the truth to protect the people who had hurt her. She knew Rica was scared of the consequences if she were honest. No child should have to live in that kind of fear. Even after the report, DCFS attempted to intervene, as per their protocol. They asked Richard and Cynthia to take Rica to see a doctor. Richard, however, claimed that Rica's doctor was on vacation and that they couldn't afford the emergency room visit, citing the cost of $200. But the cost wasn't the only issue. Cynthia, too, refused to take Rica for medical attention. She claimed Rica's medical card had expired and that she was too busy with the other children to take care of Rica, who needed medical help the most. But that wasn't the end of it. Cynthia also ignored instructions from a doctor in Pontiac, who recommended an X-ray to assess the severity of Rica's injuries. Cynthia brushed off the necessity, making excuses about her schedule. This wasn't the first time Cynthia had dismissed medical care, and it wouldn't be the last. On December 11th, 2018, just hours after DCFS made their call, an interview with Cynthia's teenage daughter revealed that she knew more than she let on about the abuse. Though the details remained unclear, it was obvious that something was being concealed. Later that day, DCFS tried to interview Cynthia's 6-year-old daughter, but Cynthia blocked their attempts, preventing any meaningful investigation into what was really happening in the household. It became painfully clear that despite all the mounting evidence, the system was failing Rica. Teachers and counselors noticed Rica's emotional decline. She began withdrawing, her grades slipping, and she became visibly distressed. Rica, once a vibrant and eager student, no longer participated in class or raised her hand. She stopped smiling and stopped talking. Teachers who had known her since kindergarten were heartbroken by the transformation. Mrs. Harris, one of Rica's teachers, remembered how Rica used to be full of life. But by spring, she had changed. She used to come to school so full of energy, but by the end, it was like she wasn't there anymore, Mrs. Harris recalled. She'd sit quietly at her desk, barely able to make eye contact with anyone. It wasn't just Rica's teachers who noticed. Her peers saw the changes too. One teacher remarked, "She used to be the first to volunteer, always eager to be involved. But now, she wouldn't even speak up in class. When I asked her if she was okay, she'd always say, 'I'm fine.' But I could see the bruises on her arms, neck, and legs. Despite the repeated reports, nothing ever changed. DCFS made a few more visits to the home, but nothing substantial came from them. Rica's case was marked as resolved each time, despite the growing evidence of harm. By April 2019, Rica's physical and emotional state had deteriorated even further. Her once bright eyes were now dull, her spirit drained. Teachers continued to notice the drastic change in her behavior. She had stopped engaging with her classmates, and the joy she once exuded was replaced by a heavy sadness. But things took an even darker turn. On the night of January 6, 2019, Cynthia's violence reached its peak. The punishments became more frequent and more brutal. That night, Rica's frail body, already weakened from months of abuse, could no longer withstand the violence. She died that night. Hospital staff worked desperately to save her, but it was too late. Rica's tiny body had endured too much. She was just 8 years old. Rica's body told the story her voice could no longer share. The doctors and nurses saw the evidence, bruises of different sizes, fresh and fading, covering her small frame. Her face, arms, back, and legs bore the marks of relentless abuse. It was clear this was no accident. Rica's autopsy, performed on January 26, 2019, revealed the extent of the damage she had endured. Dr. Matthew Fox, at the Peoria County Coroner's Office, found over 60 scars on her body. Her chin, chest, back, arms, hands, thighs, and legs were all covered in bruises, some deep, some shallow, but all indicative of a life marked by violence. Inside, the damage was even worse. Dr. Fox's findings revealed a gruesome truth. Rica had suffered extensive internal injuries. Among these were an ileal perforation, a tear in the last part of her small intestine, abdominal adhesions, bruises on her face and upper arm, hemorrhaging around the pancreas, pulmonary edema, fluid in her lungs, cerebral edema, fluid buildup around her brain, and a blood-filled abdomen, a clear sign of severe internal trauma. Dr. Fox concluded that the cause of Rica's death was peritonitis, a dangerous infection of the abdominal lining brought on by blunt force trauma, which led to overwhelming inflammation and infection. Rica's small body simply couldn't fight anymore. While peritonitis can be fatal, it doesn't have to be. If caught early, it can be treated. It's diagnosed through X-rays, blood tests, scans, or even exploratory surgery. Rica had been vomiting for at least 2 days before her death and had complained of severe abdominal pain. Cynthia Baker herself admitted that Rica had blurred vision and trouble keeping her balance. Clear, urgent signs that something was terribly wrong. If Rica had been taken to a doctor, her life could have been saved. But instead, Rica's cries for help were ignored, her suffering dismissed. She was left to die. 5 days after Rica's death, on January 31, 2019, the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, received yet another disturbing report. This time, it was alleged that Rica Rountree and Cynthia Baker had violated the safety plan by continuing to have contact with their surviving children. This raised a chilling question. Were they trying to manipulate the children into keeping their secret? Were they attempting to control the narrative before the truth could be uncovered? Although no criminal charges had yet been filed, Richard and Cynthia quickly hired an attorney. There was no funeral, no memorial for Rica. Instead, her body was sent to a funeral home in Galesburg for cremation. No ceremony, no final goodbye. But Rica's memory wouldn't be erased so easily. On February 2, 2019, just before her planned cremation, McLean County authorities intervened. They retrieved Rica's body for a second, more thorough autopsy. This examination was conducted by Chief Forensic Pathologist Dr. Scott Denton. Only after this second autopsy was completed was Rica's body cremated on February 11th. On the same day, Richard and Cynthia's remaining children were placed into protective custody. For those children, the nightmare might have finally ended, but for Rica, it was far too late. What remains now are the scars Rica left behind, not just the ones on her battered body, but also in the hearts of everyone who learned her story. Yet Cynthia Baker, the woman responsible for this brutality, showed no remorse, no grief, no sorrow. Instead, her focus was shocking. After learning of Rica's death, Cynthia's first words were not about the loss of her child, but about the vomit on the floor. "You better clean that up. It's disgusting," she said, completely indifferent to the fact that her actions had led to a child's death. This moment spoke volumes. It was clear that Rica's life, her suffering, meant nothing to Cynthia. The only thing that seemed to bother her was the inconvenience of cleaning up after a dead child. But the full extent of the horrors in that house was still hidden, until investigators uncovered something that would change everything. Upon searching Cynthia's phone, they found videos that would haunt the nation. These weren't innocent recordings. They were disturbing footage, stored in Cynthia's iCloud, documenting a life of abuse. The footage was unbearable. In one video, Cynthia can be seen screaming at Rica, forcing her to do menial tasks under threats of punishment. In another, she is physically beating Rica. The child's small body is visibly trembling with fear, trying desperately, but failing, to protect herself. As investigators and prosecutors watched the footage, their shock and disbelief were palpable. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How could a young girl endure such horror for months, perhaps years, without anyone stepping in to stop it? When the videos were leaked to the press, the public's response was swift and fierce. Outrage flooded the streets, and newsrooms were bombarded with calls. The community, once oblivious, now demanded answers. How had this gone on for so long? Why hadn't anyone intervened to save Rica? This was no longer just about one broken home. It was a wake-up call for the entire nation. How could the system have failed so completely? How could those who were supposed to protect children like Rica have turned a blind eye? On April 24, 2019, Cynthia Baker was arrested. She faced a range of charges, including first-degree murder, aggravated battery, and multiple counts of child abuse. At last, the wheels of justice began to turn. It seemed that, for once, the legal system was responding with the urgency this case demanded. But the battle wasn't over. Cynthia's arrest was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out legal fight. The public followed every twist and turn of the case, and the media closely scrutinized each detail. The nation continued to grapple with what had happened. For Rica's family, the emotional devastation was unimaginable. Antionetta, Rica's mother, was left to cope with the heart-wrenching aftermath of losing her daughter. Every day, she faced the crushing reality that she hadn't been able to protect Rica. "Every day without her feels like a lifetime," Antionetta said. "I wish I could have protected her. I failed her. I will always fail her." But it wasn't just Rica's immediate family who suffered. This tragedy reverberated through the entire community. Friends, neighbors, and teachers all looked back with painful regret. As the trial began, on one side was Cynthia Baker, accused of brutally murdering 8-year-old Rica Rountree. On the other, the prosecution, determined to bring justice for the little girl who never stood a chance. The prosecution presented a case that was both compelling and deeply unsettling. They started with forensic evidence, facts that couldn't be disputed. Rica, once a bright and lively child, had endured immense suffering. Her small frame showed signs of repeated harm, with visible bruises and burns, evidence of mistreatment that had gone on for far too long. However, it was the internal injuries that truly revealed the extent of what had happened. The medical examination painted a heartbreaking picture. Severe abdominal trauma had caused internal damage, leading to complications that ultimately claimed her life. This wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a long and troubling pattern. Then, there was the digital evidence. Investigators uncovered videos stored in Cynthia Baker's iCloud account, footage that revealed the truth of what Rica had endured. The recordings were difficult to watch. In one, Cynthia was seen yelling at Rica, forcing her to clean for hours while exhaustion took over her small body. Another showed her reacting with aggression, while Rica tried to protect herself. The emotional weight of the evidence was undeniable. The jury couldn't look away. This wasn't just testimony, it was undeniable proof. And as difficult as it was to witness, it made one thing clear. Cynthia's actions had led to an irreversible tragedy. But the revelations didn't stop there. Cynthia's own children were called to the stand, and for the first time they spoke about the environment they had lived in. Their voices trembled as they recalled the fear and isolation, the way their home had felt more like a place of control than comfort. One of them described how Rica would hide in corners, afraid to be noticed. How even the smallest mistakes could spark anger. How they had witnessed moments of despair that no child should ever have to experience. By the time Rica's family spoke, the weight of the trial was impossible to ignore. Her mother, Antionetta, stood before the court with tear-filled eyes, describing a little girl who had once been so full of joy. A child who had loved to play, to laugh, to run into her mother's arms. A child who was now gone. Her voice shook, but her message was strong. She didn't want Rica's story to fade. She wanted people to know what had happened. The trial stretched on for weeks, but when the verdict was finally delivered, there was no doubt about the outcome. Cynthia Baker was found guilty. On July 14, 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. There would be no second chances. It was justice. but it could never undo what had happened. It couldn't bring Rica back or erase the years of pain. All that remained was the heartbreaking reality. One life lost forever. While Cynthia faced her consequences, Rica's father, Rica Rountree, could not escape his own responsibility. For years, he had been aware of the situation. He had seen the signs, heard the cries, but he had chosen not to act. Evidence revealed a series of text messages between Richard and Cynthia, messages that exposed a disturbing level of disregard for Rica's well-being. They spoke about her as if she were a burden, discussing her in ways no child should ever be spoken about. One exchange showed Cynthia expressing frustration, saying it was time for Rica to leave. Richard's response: he agreed. Another message revealed a conversation where Cynthia admitted to using intimidation as a means of control. She even mentioned covering up an incident to avoid questions. Richard's reply: he approved. These messages, along with everything else presented in court, told a deeply unsettling story. But as disturbing as they were, nothing could prepare those in the courtroom for what they were about to see next. The footage revealed the heartbreaking reality of what Rica endured at the hands of those who should have cared for her. And in the end, the truth could no longer be ignored. On August 12, 2019, Rica Rountree accepted a plea deal. By pleading guilty to charges related to endangering a child's safety, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years. A punishment that felt far too lenient for someone who had stood by and allowed such suffering to happen. It wasn't justice in the fullest sense, but it was at least recognition that his inaction had played a role in this tragedy. While his sentence was nowhere near as severe as Cynthia's, it was a reminder that failing to protect a child has consequences. But Rica's case also exposed a deeper issue: serious shortcomings within the Department of Children and Family Services. Reports of mistreatment had been filed by teachers and others, yet no significant action was taken. This wasn't an isolated case. It pointed to a system struggling with a lack of resources, inadequate training, and bureaucratic obstacles that allowed children like Rica to slip through the cracks. Determined to create change, Antionetta took action. In 2020, she worked alongside lawmakers to draft a new bill designed to strengthen oversight in child welfare cases. Informally known as Rica's Law, the proposed legislation called for stricter monitoring, background checks for caregivers, and mandatory follow-ups on reported concerns. While the bill is still in progress, it marks an important step toward ensuring no other child is left unprotected. Antionetta's fight for change is making a difference, one policy at a time. But Rica's story isn't just about tragedy. It's about the lessons we need to learn. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that protecting children isn't just the responsibility of parents or teachers. It's a collective effort. It's about speaking up when something feels wrong, looking out for those who can't stand up for themselves, and demanding better from the systems meant to protect them. Her story challenges us to ask difficult but necessary questions. How can we make sure no child's pain goes unnoticed? How do we hold institutions accountable when they fail? How do we create a world where stories like Rica's never happen again? Her life was cut short far too soon, but her story continues to shine as a call for change. Justice for Rica means justice for every child. Let her story remind us to always pay attention, always speak up, and always protect those who need it most. Which part of this story impacted you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to check out our other videos, like and subscribe to support our channel. Rest in peace, little Rica.